Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and thank you for tuning in today. We are going to be talking about the bell curve, Chapter 5, talking about poverty and IQ's potential effect on poverty. We are now making the transition into part 2 of this book. Part 2 is going to deal with social classes and behavior. If you guys remember, part 1 was kind of all about the partitioning of America along these lines of IQ, a rise of the cognitive elite through these colleges and occupations, etc. And now we're going to be talking about the social impacts that IQ has on our society. A couple things. Well, we'll go to this slide here where, like I said, we're in part 2. Some things they did a little introduction before chapter 5, and not just like the italicized like mini summaries of the chapter. They did an introduction talking about some things and how most of their data, just a couple of the quick points, most of their data is going to come from the NLSY, which is, let me make sure I get this right, the National Longitudinal Survey of Labor Market Experience of Youth. So it seems like a very huge survey, a huge study. Began in 1979. Participants in the study were aged 14 to 22, and there were originally over 12,000, close to 13,000 participants in this, incorporating a weighted system so that analysts could determine the correct estimates for nationally representative samples of their age group. The NLSY, they talk about why they used it, and it's because it combines everything all into one database. So they have information in there on childhood environment, parental socioeconomic status, subsequent educational, occupational achievement, work history, family formation, as well as what they're ultimately looking for, psychometric measures of cognitive skills. So they are going to mention some things in these subsequent chapters in part 2. And I've seen this down because I've read ahead a little bit. I'm on chapter 14, I think I am. They're going to talk about different classes here. So it's important to note they have a chart here at page 121 I'm looking at. Class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the distribution of IQ. So class 1, very bright. Class 2, bright. And what I'm assuming here, this is Class 2 would be 1 standard deviation above the mean. Class 1 would be 2 standard deviations above the mean. Class 3 is normal. That's the mean. Then you have Class 4, dull, which would be 1 standard deviation below. And then very dull, Class 5. So keep that in mind. We're going to see a table in this chapter that is going to compare, well, I won't spoil it for you guys, but it's going to compare along these classes. So without further ado, let's jump into it. And first, we have a little history lesson. So the authors start off here talking about a little history. So as you guys can see, there is a graph on the right-hand side, the dramatic progress against poverty from World War II through the 1960s, stagnation since then. And in 1939, over half the people of the country lived in families with an income below the amount that constitutes the present poverty line. As you can see there, just before 1940, over 50% of Americans living below the poverty line. It's fairly staggering, and what's kind of even more staggering is as you go along, late 1960s, start of the 1970s, I mean, by in that span of 30 years, it's plummeted, but you have this stagnation since that late 1960s, early 1970s to where it is today in when the book was written, got to remember that, 1992, 14.5% of Americans living below the poverty line. So this brings up some interesting points about this graph. Like what can we take away from this graph? 3 observations. The first one, poverty cannot be simple. Direct cause of problems like crime, illegitimacy, and drug abuse. So kind of why is that? Well, I think what the authors are saying here is look at how staggering poverty was pre-World War II, or like right around World War II, and a lot of these issues, crime, illegitimacy, drug abuse, were not nearly as rampant, even with the high poverty. So kind of interesting. Next point, the pool of poor people must have changed over time. And I like what the authors write about this point here. I'm reading from page 129. As affluence spread, people who escaped from poverty were not a random sample of the population. When a group shrinks from over 50% of the population to less than 15% that has prevailed since the late 1960s, the people who are left behind are likely to be disproportionately those who suffer not only bad luck, energy, farsightedness, determination, but brains. So we discussed this, I remember, from part 1, how your pool, your friend pool kind of changed. The friend pool of like the early 1900s is different from the friend pool today, etc., etc. It's an interesting point. The next point, last point, poverty in the 1960s and the war on poverty. This was an initiative during, I believe, President Johnson. And Amity Shalise, she wrote a book regarding this. I think it's titled The Great Society, which I would love to read some of her work. She also wrote another book called The Forgotten Man about the Great Depression era. It's important to note we had this war on poverty in the 1960s, but poverty was already declining for decades before that. I mean, remember the graph. It was sharp decline. The trend line was already being established. So the war on poverty was to decrease it more. Like it wasn't decreasing fast enough. And the poverty, as you saw from that chart, from that graph, it kind of stagnated a little bit in the subsequent years. So another interesting point the authors bring up. So can an IQ score taken at 15 be the cause of poverty at age 30? This is kind of what the whole chapter is about. What's IQ's role in the probability that you grow up poor or are in poverty? So let's take a look here, considering poverty as an effect rather than a cause. Right? So we're trying to measure poverty, and this is where like dependent and independent variable come in here. So they want to measure poverty as a dependent variable, so it depends on other things. All right, so they're kind of flipping the script here, because usually it's, I don't know if it's usually, but I definitely tend to think about, okay, somebody's poor. What is them being poor going to lead to? Okay, bad health, money issues, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's kind of flipping it the other way. Well, what caused them to get to that point in their life, or maybe even not be able to get out of that state of their life? So the authors say, well, as far as IQ goes, Up to about 4 or 5 years of age, measures of IQ are not much use in predicting IQ later in life. What's better off, according to them, that you do is predict it through the parent's IQ. And as you can see in this next point, after 5, between 5 and 10, well, now an IQ test becomes more and more predictive of what your IQ is going to be for the rest of your life, or at least when you get older. And I'm wondering why, kind of like why this is. And one thing I thought of is maybe possibly, between 4 and 5 or up to 4 and 5, your brain is still so malleable and a sponge and just soaking up everything. I guess that's why they say if you want to learn a language, you do it when you're super, super young, because when you're older, it's more difficult. It's not impossible. It's just more challenging. And then once you hit the age of 5, then things start to solidify and crystallize in your mind and your brain. And now that becomes more indicative of what's going to be you in the future. So just a thought I had. I would have to do a little more research into that. Just a thought. Next section, socioeconomic background versus cognitive ability. And this is where we are going to see our next chart, our next visual table comparing these two. So the 1800s saw different kinds of poor people, deserving and undeserving. So what does that mean? Some people were poor, and I'm reading from page 131. Some people were poor because of circumstances beyond their control. Others were poor as a result of their own behavior. So think about this. Is this true today? And were people given the same leeway as they were back in those days? I mean, if you see somebody poor, homeless, let's say, for example, are you thinking that, are they deserving or undeserving? Are they there from their behavior? Are they there from some other circumstances? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure if you treat them any differently if they're deserving or undeserving, if they're one way or another. I'm not sure, but this is kind of like how they used to see it. Next point here. Most of the studies talked about, this is kind of a weird transition, but yes, so that's kind of like an introduction into what we're going to be discussing about poverty. So people thought about poverty in like these different ways. Okay. Now, the authors are going to be looking at, when they talk about these studies using NLSY data, they're only going to be looking at non-Latino whites. Why the non-Latino distinction there? I don't know why they just can't say, well, we're only going to be looking at white people or Caucasians. I'm not sure. I don't know if that's how the surveys are collected, and they need to distinguish between non-Latino whites, and perhaps there's some whites out there who are Latino as well, as, like you have like a half black, half white child. In this case, you could have like a half Latino, half white child. So I don't know. But they did this, and they were kind of smart to do it like this so that people can't bring in the race argument to, give criticism to these studies or like how they looked at this data. So they basically say, no, we're looking at just white people here. And you're going to see you're going to see kind of data that would make you think that you're looking at people of minority groups, but you got to remember, we're just looking at non-Latino whites here. So the tables on this next slide are going to be comparing poverty by socioeconomic status and cognitive class. So what you're going to notice, the top 3 classes in either category had similar poverty rates. And then as you move lower, poverty rises, and it rises even more for the cognitive classes than it does for the socioeconomic classes. So on the left, you have cognitive class. On the right, you have parent socioeconomic status and socioeconomic class. And you have what you're trying to measure is white poverty, the percentage of people in poverty. And again, this is just white people. And as you can see there, yeah, for the first 3 classes, it's fairly low. And then as you go lower on the scale, percentage in poverty jumps up. And between class 5 by cognitive class and class 5 by socioeconomic class, I'm looking at very dull and very low here, there's a 6 percentage point difference. In the class 4, there's a 4 percentage point difference. And I just asked a question, is the sample size in both of these the same? Or not even the sample size, is the sample the same? And how big is a 6% difference? I guess that's what I'm asking here. I mean, yes, there is a difference. I can visually see that, but I don't really know how big of a difference that is. Like, that could just be like, how big is the sample size truly? So what the authors want to do is they want to disentangle the roles of what explains poverty. So they do this by they want to see 2 different values here. It's a yes or a no. All right. Yes, family had an income below poverty line. No, income was above the poverty line. Okay, so that's going to be the way that we establish if you're in poverty or not. So it's only those 2 possible values. Next, they're going to perform a regression analysis, and they want to see how much poverty depends on IQ, age, and parental socioeconomic status. And they're going to ask 2 questions here. 1, given the information about intelligence, socioeconomic status, and age, what is our best estimate of the probability that a family was below the poverty line in 1989? And then they're going to ask another question. Taking other factors into account, how much remaining effect does any one of the independent variables have on the probability of being in variables, age, IQ, parental socioeconomic status? And we're going to get our next chart here on the next slide. Boom. The comparative roles of IQ and parental SES in determining whether young white adults are below the poverty line. And I'm sorry, I probably could have made this graph a little bit bigger so you guys can see, but we have 2 lines here. One of the lines represents IQ, and the other line represents parental socioeconomic status. And on the x-axis, we have standard deviations from the mean of your independent variable, or your independent variable. So if you see on the right-hand side, very high, 2 standard deviations. So 2 standard deviations of IQ or socioeconomic status. Y-axis, you have the probability of being in poverty. So answering that yes or no question. Whichever graph you're looking at, the other independent variable was held to its mean. So if you're looking at the IQ line, that's assuming a mean socioeconomic status, and then vice versa if you're looking at the SES line. And what do we see? Staggering difference. As IQ goes from low to high, the probability of being in poverty decreases, as well as it does for socioeconomic status as you go from low to high. But the change for IQ is staggering. It goes from about 26% to, close to 0. SES, it goes from, 12% to about 8, 6. It's kind of interesting. This kind of shows, would you rather be really, really poor or really, really dull? And you wouldn't want to be either of them, but it seems like having at least an average IQ can protect against being in poverty, even if you were of a low socioeconomic status. Education. So, that was a very interesting graph, but let's throw out another hypothesis here. If you can only get people to stick with school long enough, they will be able to stay out of poverty, even if they have modest test scores. So what the authors are kind of hypothesizing here is, okay, if you can stick in school, graduate college, you'll be fine. You're going to stay out of poverty. Just as long as you stay in school, you'll stay out of poverty. And with that, we get our second graph here. And I made this one bigger for you guys. I should have done it for the other one. But if you can see here, in high school, high IQ makes a difference. College, hardly anybody was poor. And you have two groups of lines here, one for the high school grads, one for the college grads. Same kind of settings, not settings, but same kind of rules apply for this graph as it did the last one. So it's comparing SES and IQ between college grads and high school grads. And for the high school grads, it kind of looks similar to the previous graph, right? IQ seems to be highly, highly protective of staying out of poverty, right? And lower IQs increases your chances more of being in poverty than lower socioeconomic status. Now, take a look at the college graduates. It almost like doesn't really make a huge difference. Between socioeconomic status and IQ. Hardly anyone was poor in college. So as long as what this is kind of telling me is, as long as you graduate college, you have a good chance of staying out of poverty, whether you have a high or low IQ or come from a high or low socioeconomic background. But for the high school, that high IQ, or having at least a mean IQ, was a ton better than having just a mean socioeconomic status but a low IQ. And I think we're going to discuss this a little bit. Yep, basic lessons from the graph, what we can learn from here. The people who complete a bachelor's degree seldom end up poor, no matter what. So kind of why is that? And the authors talk about there's a floor income when it comes to college grads, and how that floor income can still keep you above the poverty line, and irrespective of what your IQ is. The one question I ask is if this is true today as it was back then. I'm not really sure, because now the stigma now is everybody's getting college degrees, and the college degree is kind of like yesteryear's high school degree. Also, college has economic value independent of cognitive ability. It kind of shows your determination. They have a distance that make for economic success in life. And I don't disagree with that. Second point here, for the high school graduates, IQ has a strong effect independent of socioeconomic background. That's kind of what we were just discussing moments ago. So, interesting what we see so far. It seems like socioeconomic background doesn't have the effect that I kind of thought it would as compared to the effect of IQ on your. Now we're going to turn to children. And specifically children, I think less than age 15, I think, is their cutoff, because they're going to say a stat here. As of 1991, 22% of all children under the age of 15 were below the official poverty line, and that's twice as much as age 15 and over. So poverty hits children a lot harder than adults or people over the age of 15. Poverty among children has been higher in families headed by a single woman. Doesn't matter whether she is divorced or never married. 36% of children living in poverty in 1991 compared to 36% in 1991 compared to 6% for families not headed by a single woman. So this is comparing up poverty in children. 36% with a single mother, or excuse me. Yes, 36% single woman raising the family, 6% families where you're presumably married or the woman is not heading the family. Maybe they're not married still, maybe boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. So these are kind of interesting points. I've heard this discussed before in the past. So increasing child poverty contributed by increasing numbers of children being raised in a single parent household headed by a woman. Okay, so that has an effect on it. Now what the authors are going to attempt to do is to see what's the role of the mother's IQ and socioeconomic status on that child growing up in poverty. Is it going to make a difference, right? Like it did before in those other previous charts, looking at high school grads, college grads, etc. Is this going to make a difference? Well, let's see. We're going to go to our next chart here, the role of mothers' IQ. So as you can see the graph, God, I should have made that first one big for you guys. See, I made all the other ones. In determining which white children are poor. So we have here very similar chart, IQ, specifically IQ on the x-axis, standard deviations. Y-axis, we have probability of being in poverty as a percentage. Two lines. One of the lines, married white mothers. The other line, white mother, separated, divorced, or never married. And right away, you can see the difference between the married and unmarried mothers. Married white mothers, substantial. Even if they were very low IQ, two standard deviations below the mean, right around 20% chance of the child being in poverty. All right, which is still high. Don't get me wrong. I mean, that almost equals the high point of the other graphs, which were like close to 30%, right? That's still very high. But compared to single white mothers under two standard deviations of IQ, they're almost at 70% chance their child grows up probably and ends up in poverty. And then look at the decrease, the effect that IQ has on those single white mothers, and the substantial decrease as you move from high IQ to, low IQ to high IQ. Between two standard deviations below and above the mean for single white mothers, the chances of that child growing up in poverty from 70% to like 20%, 50% decrease. For the married white mothers, there is a decrease, but not nearly that much. But also the chances of their child growing up in poverty, definitely not as high as the unmarried mothers. So let's continue to the next slide. And what are kind of the points that we take away from? I think this is the last point. IQ is extremely important in determining poverty among women without a husband present. So very important. I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to see if it's more important than socioeconomic status. And that's the next slide here. See, got a little ahead of myself. Role of mothers is socioeconomic status in determining which white children are poor here. And it's interesting the difference between these two graphs. Now we have parental socioeconomic status on the x-axis. Again, very low to very high in standard deviations. And we have two lines again, single mothers, married mothers. Look at their trajectory, if you guys are watching this. Very similar trajectory. Very similar ranges between these two lines. Right? So what this tells me, again, being married is a protective factor in keeping your child from being in poverty. That's one thing this is telling me, because there's still a socioeconomic status. Even if you were to raise it, it does not have as much of a protective effect. The chances of ending up in poverty decrease, but not by much compared to IQ. Not that much. So definitely went against the grain of kind of what I've been taught and kind of what I have learned and consumed through media. So what are the implications of this? Well, children, as we saw from that stat in the one slide from 1992, are more often to be poor than adults. And the rate in 1992 was about double the amount of children in poverty versus people over the age of 15. Also, family breakup is responsible for a major portion of the increase in child poverty. And we kind of have cut a glimpse charts comparing single mothers and unmarried mothers, or single mothers and married mothers. And complications of poverty hit unmarried mothers at low levels of intelligence much harder than they do those at high levels of intelligence, even after socioeconomic background is held constant. The main points from those graphs looking at mothers. So now this is our last policy thoughts at bay. Education is important in affecting poverty. So what would be the next step? So the authors kind of ask it in this way. So by complicating the picture, we raise additional questions. Education, intelligence, and socioeconomic status are related to years of education. We saw this comparing high school graduates and college graduates in that one graph. High school graduates, substantial decrease in poverty going from low to high IQ. In the college graduates, hardly anybody was poor, regardless of your IQ, regardless of the socioeconomic background you come from. So next, a marriage is important in determining poverty. So we ask the question, how is intelligence and socioeconomic status related to marriage? So the authors are going to start to do this in the subsequent chapters, and we'll see this. All of this, again, is encompassing part 2, which is social classes and behavior. So the main narrative is that SES is the primary driving force behind poverty. I think and this is something I just touched on just moments ago, like that definitely flies in the face of what I assumed, what I have been taught, is that, hey, socioeconomic status drives poverty. If you come from a poor background, you're going to end up, the system is against you. It's the system. All right, it's the establishment that is keeping you poor. And I mean, I don't disagree with that to a certain extent. But remember, the poverty rate for whites in class 5 of the intelligence cognitive class was 30%. And again, 6 percentage points higher than class 5 for socioeconomic status. Right? So, will curing poverty work? How can you cure something when you don't know how it happened, how it came about, right? Because you're putting forth cures, you're putting forth programs, assistance, based on the fact that you think that it's a socioeconomic problem. But should we be tailoring these methods, these programs in a certain way that addresses the IQ problem versus the socioeconomic problem? And that's the question I think that we should be asking. I think that's what the authors are kind of getting at here. How does it? And that's something that we should be thinking about, and we're going to be discussing in the subsequent chapters here in part 2. We're going to be looking at crime. We're going to be looking at illegitimacy, etc. We're going to be looking at citizenship, all in chapter 2 here. So how does it interact with all these other social issues in America right now? And with that, that concludes our session. Thank you very much, everybody. If you made it this far, watch to the end, thank you so much for doing that. We have had an uptick in viewers. I love seeing that. Some new people subscribing. Love seeing that. If you have any questions, comments, please send them below. Let's start a discussion. Let's talk about this kind of stuff. Let's agree. Let's disagree on things. I would love to get in those conversations. We have a video coming next week with winning in mind, and then we will return to bell curve after that. Again, guys, thank you very much. If you like this content, please subscribe. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.